It's amusing that Ellis has a little sketch there in the background of Florian's. So given to him on his on your wedding day or on your wedding anniversary.
Civil partnership, yeah.
Civil partnership. So there we are. Just how important these little moments are for people in their lives. The sketch. So a little preamble before I start, which is that when I was joined it was then the North London Poly, amazingly, in something like 1990. It's been through a few name changes since. I struggle to keep up with the name changes often. I was asked to head up with a lovely architect called Rex Henry, a computer drawing program introducing students to how to draw on the computer. And I had started my own practice in 1988 and had decided at that stage that it would be a good thing if everybody in the practice was familiar with drawing on the machine. And so that's how I set the practice up. We all had a machine, and that was quite an innovative moment, we thought, at the beginning. But I've been teaching now at, currently it's called the School of Art, Architecture and Design at the London Metropolitan University for nearly 30 years. And what I have started to understand in my teaching with students is they are losing some of that capacity to draw by hand because they become so involved with the machine, and it's a very absorbing world. And as we all know, time on the computer sort of goes at a different pace than it seems to in the normal world. And this has led me to think that there's an issue there, especially for designers of complex buildings, that the use of a pencil and a piece of paper, the thinking process, the interrelationship between the hand and the eye and the piece of paper, and literally, you know, as we all say, you know, working things out on a piece of paper, that started to drift away, and I think that's not necessarily a good thing. So when I was preparing this little talk for the discussion group at the Royal Academy, I thought that I could look, this was last year, at the issue of sketching, and maybe I could form some sort of conclusion about that and use that in my teaching. So I'll just a little preamble before I start with the very few slides that we've got to go through. It's the definition: a rapidly executed freehand drawing that is not usually intended as a finished work. So it's a sort of intermediate process drawing. Sketchiness, sketching, preliminary study, organizing space or form or color or texture, a representation of something not understood yet. So it contains the idea, but it isn't the idea. I've been teaching architecture for over 30 years now and have developed a sort of radar about drawings produced by students. I've observed that students often produce compelling sketches about their projects, often diagrammatic plan arrangements of the main spaces fitting onto the site, sometimes involving orientation, the direction of sunlight or access, highlighting a significant feature, a tree, for example, a view, a boundary edge. In others, a cross-section through the site with levels connecting opposite sides of the building, or adjustments to internal floor heights and room heights, with directions of sunlight or view highlighted. Context elevations where the surrounding buildings are shown approximately to scale with relative heights, and the scale of openings and fenestration with an indication of the type of facade that might fit within such a varied but abstracted and simplified street view. Then again, when the design starts to be developed, much of the richness of this sketch, or perhaps it's the ambiguity, it gets lost in the redrawing, especially when the student starts to use a computer and a mouse. And this loss can often be due to an early focus on technical things and losing the potential richness of the complex ideas which demand to be developed slowly. Sometimes the flexibility of the original sketch allows for variations and versions, often on the same piece of paper, to be assessed in proximity to one another in both space and time. A sense of the flow of ideas from the daunting blank white piece of paper to filling it up with potentialities and explorations. Nothing fixed, but an idea pursued across the flat surface of the drawing. Occasionally, a sketch can inspire a significant change in approach or eliminate a whole set of requirements. If produced with thought, these types of drawings can form the core and substance of the design for many weeks or even months and maintain that momentum, even though they are a product of just seconds or minutes. How is this possible? So I'm going to share my screen with you now. And I'm going to go here. And then I'm going to go there. And I hope you can see the starting page there. Hope that's okay. Okay. So on to the first starting point. Now, because I gave this at the Royal Academy, I started with a reference to a painting by Delacroix because of a quotation which I'd found of his, which I think is really an amazing definition of what an artist might need from a sketch. So we have here the sketch above and the finished painting below. I'll explain the blue in a moment, of The Lion Hunt by Delacroix. So Eugene Delacroix, he says, the first idea of the sketch, the egg or embryo of the idea, so to speak, is nearly always far from complete. Everything is there, if you like, but this everything has to be released, which simply means joining up the various parts. The precise quality that renders the sketch the highest expression of the idea is not the suppression of details, but their subordination to the great sweeping lines that come before everything else in making the impression. So that's a little quote that Lucy Norton made in a book actually about Peter Markli, who will appear later in the lecture, published by Quartet Publishers in 2017. Now, the background to this painting and my reason for including it is down to an article in a publication called the London Review of Books, which I get. And if you don't know it, it's a fantastic publication because it covers a whole range of, from politics and science to the arts and psychology. And in this particular article about Delacroix, the writer T.J. Clark makes the following statements, and I'm going to read those to you. The sketch, which is above here on this window here on my computer, the sketch is 3 foot by 4 foot. It is a marvel, and it clearly was for Delacroix an indispensable step towards the final 8.5 foot by 12 foot painting, which is the painting below it. That's a massive 2,600 millimeters by 3,650 millimeters if you are not familiar with feet. Colour had to be established from the start as the unnegotiable armature of the scene. Baudelaire in 1855, when he saw the painting for the first time, called the large-scale lion hunt an explosion of colour. The fire of 1870, no doubt, dimmed the explosion a little. And that is the element of the blue on the lower image. This element of the painting was lost in a fire in the museum where it was hanging at the time. The soft glare, as if from a set of floodlights, the local clashes of red, blue and white can still stop you in your tracks. One imagines Delacroix in his studio working on the fallen horse and rider, or trying to fix the colour relation between the lioness's yellow and the red and blue-black above and below her, constantly looking across at the sketch on his side wall in the studio. Is there such a relationship between this architect sketch and an architect sketch? And I think of the possibilities here. So T.J. Clarke says these things about the sketch and the painting. Look at the horse's head in the sketch. It's in bottom part of the sketch, about just left of center. You can see the nose of the horse. It is by comparison with the head of the finished painting, again, bottom right, but a bit further up, unproblematic. Maybe once we've grown used to what it became, even a trifle glib. Look at the descent of the proportions, the easy plausibility of the fallen rider's body and the last gasp grip of his thumb. Correctness of drawing is still too general a description. Let the outlines of the figures be jagged and staccato. And in general, let the arbitrariness, the abbreviation, involved in turning 3 dimensions into 2 be clear. And this leads straight to the kind of drawing I've been mainly celebrating, which outlines not just declaring their artifice, but the whole form of the figure, the whole upper body of the fallen rider, his arms, shoulder, neck, and head, his hold onto the mane, his turban against the black of the horse's knee, somehow positively laying claim to contrary positions, multiple kinds of extensions of space. In Line Hunt, the contraries are distinct. Look back at the horse and rider in the oil sketch, and you will see the immensity of the effort made as the months went on to turn a merging of identities into a desperate standoff. The overall composition in the main painting, the arrangement of elements, could be considered the same or at least equivalent in the sketch and the finished painting. There is the inclusion of matter, heaviness, texture against the light, shade, translucency and transparency. What is more or less important? The painting below was a grand commission for the 1855 Exposition Universelle in Paris, an opportunity to extend the normal range of ambition to celebrate the great themes of human survival and human knowledge. In the quotation read out previously, one can see how Delacroix is talking about both the specific and the general, and at the same time trying to find the right balance between the wholeness of the composition and the particular realization of a sectional part. He realizes, I think, that the detail within the context of the whole is the ultimate goal. Detailed refinement takes time, however, and if pursued with narrowness, the original idea can be lost. This can definitely happen in architecture as the design is passed around from hand to hand during the process of realization. Delacroix, one imagines, worked on his painting alone. The other aspect mentioned by T.J. Clarke in his article, he had in mind for his essay, the title, Delacroix's Drawing. For immediately the colors of objects and atmospheres begin to be looked at and fixed full strength, but put side by side in the picture, they inevitably throw back the surfaces they adhere to, the edges they stop at, and the orientations they evoke and displace into a strange new conceptual space. The essay T.J. Clarke eventually published in the London Review of Books is called The Horse's Impossible Head. Clarke says, take the horse's head. It is first and foremost a picture of a creature looking death in the face. The blood in the horse's nose is beautiful and disgusting, bubbling out of the nostril with a thick viscosity. The cold gold of the horseman's tunic, again with exquisite green filigree, for surely one's first appreciation of the horse is that its head is seen from the side, facing straightforwardly left. But then the head flickers. It agonizes between 2 possible positions. It is the ideogram of a body at breaking point. What also, for instance, do we think of the man in the turban? What is he looking at? The head is a tour de force of spatial projection. You look at it in relation to its neighbors and it hurtles towards you, breaking through the picture plane. Is that the rider's red shoe jabbing against the painting's left edge? The whole painting is built, as one explores it, on this kind of flickering and doubling of identities, the relentlessness of deformations, the weird consistency. They're filling every inch of every available space must have been what made the lion hunt so hard to finish. So that's in effect where I started thinking about the relationship of sketches to finished buildings. In this example, though, this is Peter St. John's sketch of the new visitor centre library building at Gladstone Museum in Cheshire. And you can see the sketch above is a sketch and a computer simulated image of the same view done in the office, Caruso St. John office. And when I asked Peter whether I could borrow the sketch and show it at my lecture, he wrote to me with the sketch and said the following: I used to sketch a lot, and I wanted just once to show a sketch in a lecture, as it felt true. Increasingly, the younger people in our office can make rendered images very quickly, which are to me all about communicating to lay people, and I don't like them. I think Peter meant he doesn't like the computer images, not the people. So I think showing a sketch was trying to rebel a bit, but you have to be careful not to be sentimental. Generally, I wouldn't talk about sketches to other people. It feels sort of indulgent. It's a quick way of expressing things, but the idea is there before the sketch. It is not more precious than words or writing notes. And I find it pretentious to sketch beautifully and gave up trying to do that a long time ago. There are architects whose sketches are different. Caesar especially, Alvaro Caesar that is, especially, which are explorations of proportions, and Peter Markli, whose sketches are ideas. And it was rather gratifying at that point when I received that sketch from Peter that I had in fact included, as you will see in a moment, some sketches by Caesar and Markli in the rest of the talk. So it sort of started to come together, this theory. I'm first, though, going to talk a little bit about a sketch which was prepared for this house in Prague by Adolf Loos. Architects will probably know this quite well. For those non-architects, this is called the Mueller House. It's built in a sort of hillside suburb of Prague, north of the river, and looks out across the valley, and is very important, I believe, in architectural history, because it's a point in Loos's development where he is starting to think about this idea of a flowing space between rooms. And so whilst we can see in the photograph, the exterior of the house is this very cubic form, a very simple form, rectangular, square in profile. The interior, the lower image, is a much more complicated idea of how he might, whilst maintaining the ideas of rooms on the interior, he's at the same time breaking them down. And the resolution of this building and the other Mueller House in Vienna was a crucial turning point, I think, in his development. The sketch I want to show is the above, obviously, and it relates to the plan of the building, which received its planning approval in 1929, actually after the construction had started. I've done that once or twice myself, and it's always a bit of a gamble. But in this case, Luce's sketch postdates the drawing below. So the sketch, the upper image here, it appears later than the plan below it. The sketch by the architect has the attributed date of June 1929. And although construction had started already, by July 1929, the external walls and the roof of the structure were all complete. So in the sketch, the layout of the internal staircases, and there are many, that's part of that complicated interpenetration of the spaces that we saw in that interior photograph. The sketch illustrates the choices being considered about the internal circulation. You can see that there are some things which are fixed, and I think it's interesting that the sketch doesn't really show the external wall. That's already, by the time this sketch is done, is in existence. So it's not really figuring in what this sketch is about. You can see the two internal columns in the sketch, which are reproduced in the plan below. And those are probably the two most significant internal elements which define the separation between the living space, which is on the left, and the dining space, which is in the upper middle part of the plan, in that famous internal perspective, internal view. The main change being considered is the more private vertical staircase to the top floors. And Luce in the sketch is testing whether the staircase can be turned at right angles to the entrance direction, which is the entrance is on the right-hand side of the plan, and you walk through the house to the rooms at the back, which are on the left-hand side of the plan. And the solution minimizes the space for circulation between the two separate circulation routes for visitors and the family, and of course, in those days, staff. The importance of the pair of internal columns, a dramatic feature of the living space, with connections between the salon and the dining room, is shown by their enlarged size and heavier shading in the sketch. The sketch omits the projecting bay on the east elevation as the focus is on the internal arrangements. There does not appear to be a lift. The building permit plan, of the first floor, which has been drawn in December 1928, so 6 months before that sketch, was submitted in January 29, but only approved in June, with design amendments to the top floor, which I'm not showing. In this plan, the orientation of the private staircase has been rotated and placed parallel to the entrance passage on the ground floor, and therefore hidden away from visitors. Behind it, as it were, is the general movement towards the rear or garden facade. Its construction is shown as completed in site photographs taken in July 29. And so the sketch is merely about the sequence of movements, which is probably a lecture in its own right. But in the final plan, I think we can see that the lift, which is in the position of the sketched in staircase, that's taken priority and is, I think, a late addition to the brief by the client. And they're discussing in the sketch whether they really do need the lift. The lift, it always seemed to me, in terms of this plan, sits rather awkwardly in terms of its circulation connections to the staircases that are going round and about. So I think that's an interesting use of a sketch at a point where the building is actually being built. This is a sketch produced maybe to have a conversation with the client. Peter Markli is another interesting contemporary architect. He's given his very famous, 3.5-hour lectures at the London Metropolitan University. We've sat through sometimes most of that, perhaps never all of it. I haven't certainly sat through all of them. He's an interesting designer for me and I think other teachers, because he sort of combines this classical formality with a rather unique take on contemporary issues. I love the way he sketches, and here are two of his sketches. On the left, a small house, a garden, or is it a front facade sketch? It's got obviously ideas, a separation between the ground floor and the first floor. There seems to be a lightness about the first floor and a heaviness to the ground floor. There seems to be a pair of columns possibly in that sketch, maybe with capitals, maybe beam ends. It's left ambiguous. The first floor is slightly higher than the lower floor. There's a sort of symmetry, but it's not complete. We can see pairs of things. We can see widths and spacings adjusted. There's a central emphasis, which is also undermined. That's on the left. On the right, is this a sketch for a slightly larger house? Seems to have 3 stories. It could be a small public building, I suppose. 3 or 4 stories, maybe. I don't know. That ground floor on the right hand sketch could be that lower section of black and red. Difficult to say, although in the center of the sketch there appears to be a sort of doorway with maybe a fan light above it. Difficult to tell. But then it's accompanied by this strange little plan, I think, at the bottom, where the line of the facade, which you can see is running behind these black rectangles or squares, which seem to sit in front. So I'm looking again at the plan, and I'm looking again back at that elevation above it, and I can see that the black rectangles along that bottom edge of the sketch, which I thought might be openings, certainly the black rectangles in the center of the sketch at the upper levels, they seem to be windows, a bit like the loose house in Prague, sitting in this red wall, red brick perhaps, or red paint like the photograph I showed just now, red painted concrete. But then it's clear that on the plan, those black rectangles at the bottom of the sketch are projecting forward. They are like pilasters or columns stuck to the facade. So maybe they're in some sort of black stone, or maybe stained black concrete. The blackness, therefore, of the openings is sort of undermined in the sketch, and we're not quite sure when we've got the plan and the elevation together on the sheet what it is we're actually looking at on that red sketch above it. Is it a surface with holes, or is it a surface with elements placed in front of it? So it's a very ambiguous sketch, and something of the quality that Peter Markli, I think, is famous for, and why I think students might benefit from looking at his work in more detail and understanding that their sketches can be ambiguous, and that gives them some extra mileage, I think, in thinking about composition and the form of the building that they're considering to develop. These is a sketch by Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell of Grafton Architects. It's a lovely sketch. It's a sketch of the School of Economics in Milan. It's done in about 2008. I'm not sure which one did it. I think it's one of them. I don't think it's both of them. It's for the University Luigi Bocconi, and it's an idea which I think great architectural sketches might have, which is about the building in relation to its context, although, which is, I think, fantastic in the sketch, the rest of Milan is not shown. We might have on the extreme left of the sketch a car or a bus, or maybe a group of people. But the idea of the sketch, of course, is that the building, the faculty building, sits above the public space, which flows underneath it. And that's expressed by the undulating arrow that penetrates through the building from left to right. And against that is written public city campus. So there's a sort of sense that the new building will be a facility which will act as a sort of portal or float above this public continuation of public space through and underneath the building. In the left-hand part of the sketch, we can see also that the ground is cut away, and there are things in the basement, possibly auditoria. And of course, we can see in the later model that is indeed true, that there are underground, as it were, auditoria which sit underneath the faculty offices, which float above. And that the faculty offices are in separate strips with gaps between. And the gaps between allow light to come in from the top and illuminate the undercroft of the building. And we can see that then is modified in the model so that the auditoria and the meeting spaces below are effectively lit from above by light which comes down between the perhaps their floors of offices over the top. And it's clear when we look at the top right sketch that there's a further examination of how that light will get to the interior, coming from either direction, from the sky down through those gaps in the building. And then there's a little note top right which says, I think, bib, which might be a bib, the library element of the building, and a number 12, which I think is great because that's architecture. And there could be the number of meters above street level, or the limitation on the height of the building at that point. It could be the number of floors. I didn't think it's the number of floors. Doesn't seem to be that many in the sketch, but clearly something to do with dimension. What's interesting, I think, to compare the final building and this model with the sketch is that the idea of the undulating arrow, the interpenetration of the public space through the building, linking the faculty to the rest of the city, has been lost in the final model because the heights and the spatial requirements of the auditoria have sort of filled in the gap between the ground level, the archaeological ground level, and the building floating above. So in an interesting juxtaposition here of a sketch in which some things about the sketch just can't work, and something has to be given up in order to allow other things to work. So I think that's an interesting sort of sense. The final image is taken from a sketchbook which is in the collection of the drawing matter collection in a lovely farm in Somerset. If you don't know drawing matter, they are an organisation that collects architects' drawings and allow their viewing by the public. You have to make bookings, but it's a marvelous place to visit. Very, very exciting to travel there. And this is a page from Alvaro Caesar's sketchbook, which is dated 2013. It's on a piece of A4. It's pen and ink. And in the collection, Andrew Clancy has written about it in these terms. One of the items in the drawing matter collection is a notebook once owned by Alvaro Caesar. In it is this sketch, made of the Royal Academy in London, where he was asked to consider making some work for an exhibition. He has drawn the courtyard where the work is to be placed. In the foreground, we see his hand poised over the page of a notebook, which is open on a table. The page of this notebook is blank, implying that the sketch we are looking at captures the moment as Caesar started to make it. There is a delay, the duration of making the drawing. Between the blank sketchbook captured here and the actual sketchbook I hold in my hands. The more I look at it, the more this delay seems to me to outweigh all the other parts of the drawing. So this is a type of sketch drawing of the Royal Academy courtyard, a drawing of looking at the courtyard through the designer's eyes. Caesar seems to be saying that this is his take on the place he has been asked to work in. And such a drawing can summarize to him what's important. The person entering the courtyard from Piccadilly, the stone pediment of the window in the courtyard, looking out over the courtyard, the cyclist padlocking his bike to the railings. Perhaps even the person watching all these things happen together. Thank you very much. That's the talk.
Oh, thank you hugely. Perhaps if we unshare your screen and then we can see you.
I will try and unshare my screen.
Now, if people have things they want to ask or comments they want to make, just alert me in the chat box, and I'll give you the microphone. I mean, it's interesting. Actually, one of the interesting themes that's emerged in the 100-Day Studio has been a recurrent preoccupation with drawing. We've had a series of the drawing matter, and Mary Scrotfeld have been curating, looking at a lot of images from the drawing matter collection, which I'd recommend. Neil McLaughlin studio hosted a collective drawing activity where over 100 people were involved in producing a drawing over the course of an hour. And Helen Thomas and Ashley Chichek had a session called Wasting Time with Drawing, which was based around the publication of a new issue of Arsa on that theme. So I'd encourage people to explore all of the previous material from the 100-Day Studios available to view on our YouTube channel. But Bob, I mean, one of the things that was striking, I think, in your presentation was that in some architects' hands, the sketches a vehicle for simplification and condension of information. I guess so someone like Norman Foster may be most kind of emphatically, where in a way one senses always the problem of the complexities of a brief being condensed down into a single problem through their crystallization in a single sketch. What's happening in a Peter Merkley drawing is entirely different. It feels that there's a kind of search for particularity and specificity rather than kind of a move towards the general.
I think you're right. I didn't include any of those sort of Norman Foster type sketches in my thinking, because they seem to be more about diagrams, more about explaining the idea to perhaps, as Peter suggests, a lay audience, so that there are moments of clarity, of clearness, of definition. And what I like about the sketches that I've been trying to talk about, and which I get engaged with in talking about both my own work with the people in my office, but also with the students, is what they contain, or what they potentially can contain, and how that can be communicated to others. And I think what the main difference between architects and artists seems to me is that we depend on our drawings to facilitate this conversation, that as the design is developed, as it gets passed literally around from hand to hand, what focuses that process is the sketch. And I omitted, I should have mentioned this in my reference to Peter St. John's sketch. What he said, which struck me in his lecture, his inaugural lecture, was that he uses the sketch occasionally, not always, but occasionally, to go back to right at the end of the design process to check whether they've got where they wanted to get to when they started off. And that's an extraordinarily powerful product of the sketch, which is this thing done in almost no time, and yet seems to, in certain cases, hold all of this bigger idea throughout, not only throughout the whole process, which might be months and months and months and months of lots of people working on it, but seems to control the end product in itself. And that quotation, the Delacroix quotation, I think is just so clever in the way that he's saying it's not the thing, but it's the idea about the whole thing. And I love that idea of ambiguity in the sketch and the potentiality of it.
I mean, I've always thought that, certainly an architect like Markli, but perhaps someone like Jan de Velde, also that there's a when they build, there's almost there's a kind of graphic sensibility at play in there's sort of ambiguity between the decisions that get made kind of in a sketchbook and that get made on a building site, so that a grid of, you know, the grids that we see on some of Markli's buildings, you know, or the kind of Leverance inspired kind of whether it's kind of construction, concrete formwork grids or applied grids. There's a sort of graphic language that's actually found itself into the very nature of the architecture, which feels like it's emerged from the process of sketching.
Yes. I was taught, interestingly, by Birkin Hayward, and he's very, very famous for his ability to show a Norman Foster scheme in a series of very, very simple, beautiful line perspectives. Generally, they were perspectives, using minimum elaboration, and that ability also to be clear and to be precise and to be communicative, I think, is another important element of the sketch. The Delacroix sketch, where I started all this thinking, of course, was a sort of private conversation between Delacroix and himself, and it's there because he knows he's going to spend months and months and months working on this enormous, I mean, I can't imagine painting something so big, an enormous panel, and then trying to remember where the idea started, and not to get drawn off into doing things that wasn't in the initial intention. One can only admire that ability to, as he says, sketch something out and then effectively stick to it through that tremendously long process. And also, make it better. I mean, that's the other aspect, isn't it? The building, which is one thing. That's why I keep trying to explain to the students, the building is only one thing. It's not a dozen things. It's not even two things. It's one thing that we've come to at the end of the whole process, where we've started with 1 million possibilities, and strangely we've got it down to just one at the end, and that is hopefully a very rich, an enriching process, and not a debilitating, reductive process through the time that's taken. So yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon.
I mean, Bob, as you said, this talk sort of emerged from this is a sort of second performance of a talk that was originally presented to a group of architects and artists. I wondered if, how did the artists respond? Was there an interest from them in the way architects draw? I mean, I was thinking, I've never seen an exhibition of architects' drawings and artists' drawings kind of shown in the same space, but it would be an interesting exercise to see if there was a kind of dialogue to be established.
We have it's a sort of discourse. So we have this conversation after we've done our little presentations and discussed that. Strangely, I didn't get the sense of artists thinking about their sketches in the way that architects do. They're means to an end. I thought for an artist, they're necessary to hold the concept in place, but they don't have, maybe, it's for the architect, it's more the romance of the sketch, the quickness of it, which is in exact contrariness to the enormous time and the effort that it takes us to make a building. The impetus, I think, for the whole talk has come because I spend a lot of time teaching also technology at the university, and that's a very focused element of how you make a wall and a floor stick together. And I don't want to feel that I'm losing my interest in these other aspects of architecture, and I want to be trying to connect both my ways of thinking, but also methods of production of ideas. And so I wanted to do this talk originally because I didn't want to talk about the general world of architecture. I wanted to find a specific topic to discuss.
Thank you, Bob. I don't know if you remember, I think you mentioned your computer drawing course, which I took in 1996.
Yes.
I passed.
Year four.
We were tasked with drawing in MiniCAD, a version of the Schroeder house. And I've taken some encouragement from the last hour that maybe what I failed to grasp at the time maybe didn't mean so much.